Every November, the mist comes to Hollow Pines. It rolls in thick and heavy, swallowing the town in a damp, eerie silence. Some say it's just the weather, a natural phenomenon caused by the nearby lake. But others, especially the older folks, warn against venturing out when the mist is at its thickest. Stay inside, my grandmother used to say. Lock your doors, keep your lights on, and never, never answer a knock after dark. I always thought it was just a spooky tale meant to keep kids from wandering into the woods at night. But last year, I learned how wrong I was. It started the week before Thanksgiving. The mist came early that year, shrouding Hollow Pines in a ghostly haze. I'd just moved back to town to take care of my grandmother's old house after she passed. The place was falling apart, creaky floorboards, leaky pipes, the works, but I figured it would be better than paying rent in the city. The first few nights were uneventful, if a little lonely. The house was tucked away at the edge of the woods, far from the main road. During the day, it was peaceful. But at night, the silence pressed in, broken only by the occasional rustle of branches or the call of an owl. On the third night, I heard it, a soft knock at the front door. It was nearly midnight. I froze, the sound catching me off guard. No one ever came this far out, especially not that late. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I peered through the peephole but saw nothing. Just the mist, swirling in the porch light. Hello? No answer. I waited a few minutes, heart thudding in my chest, but the knocking didn't return. The next morning, I mentioned the strange incident to Mrs. Carter, my neighbor down the road. She was in her 60s, with a sharp tongue and a no-nonsense attitude. You heard knocking? She asked, her expression darkening. I nodded. Don't open the door if it happens again, she warned. It's probably just kids playing pranks, but you can't be too careful this time of year. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press her. That afternoon, I decided to explore the woods behind the house. They'd always fascinated me as a kid, with their twisting paths and towering pines. The mist lingered between the trees, giving the forest an almost dreamlike quality. As I walked, I began to notice something strange, small, makeshift altars scattered among the roots. Each one held a candle, long since burned out, and a piece of clothing, scarves, gloves, even a tattered shoe. A chill ran through me, and I hurried back to the house. That night, the knocking came again. It started around 11:30, faint at first but insistent. I sat in the living room, staring at the door, every instinct screaming at me to ignore it. But then I heard something else, a voice. It whispered, barely audible over the sound of the wind. I stood up, my legs trembling. The voice was soft, almost childlike, and it tugged at something deep inside me. I approached the door, my hand hovering over the lock. Who's there? No response. I should have walked away. I should have listened to Mrs. Carter. But instead, I unlocked the door and opened it. The porch was empty. I stepped outside, the mist curling around my ankles. The air felt heavier than before, thick and suffocating. Hello? I called out. The woods were silent. Then, just as I was about to go back inside, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was small, almost child-sized, with long, dark hair that obscured its face. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching. I backed away, slamming the door shut. The next day, I went into town hoping to distract myself, but instead, I found answers I didn't want. At the local diner, I overheard a group of older men talking about the mist. They say it's the ones who got lost, one of them said, his voice low. The ones who never came back. Another nodded. Every year around this time, they knock on doors, looking for someone to let them in. My stomach churned as I listened. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a ghost story. But the look in their eyes was anything but playful. Don't open the door, one of them said, glancing at me as if he knew what I'd done. Once you invite them in, they don't leave. That evening, I barricaded the door and windows, determined not to let anything inside. The knocking started earlier this time, around 10 o'clock. It was louder, more persistent, accompanied by soft whispers that seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls. I sat in the living room, clutching a flashlight, trying to drown out the noise. But then something new happened. The whispers turned into a low, mournful wail, like the sound of someone crying. It filled the house, echoing off the walls. "Let us in," a voice pleaded. I shut my eyes, trying to block it out. The temperature in the room dropped, and the lights flickered. I felt a presence behind me, cold and heavy, but I didn't dare turn around.
"Let us in,"
the voice repeated, louder this time. And then just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. When morning came, the mist was gone. The air felt lighter, and the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. But something had changed. The woods behind my house seemed darker, the trees taller and more imposing. And the altars, the ones I'd found days before, were gone, as if they'd never been there. I packed my things and left that day, abandoning the house to its ghosts. I still don't know what I let in that night. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. But every November, when the mist rolls in, I lock my doors, keep my lights on, and never answer a knock after dark. They always say this time of year is when the veil between the living and the dead is at its weakest. I never paid much attention to it. It sounded like the kind of superstition people use to justify their fear of the dark. But last November, I experienced something that changed how I see the world, and honestly, how I see myself. It started in my hometown. I was visiting my mom after months of being away for college. She'd been nagging me to come home for weeks, guilt-tripping me about missing the All Souls Day vigil at our old church. "It's important," she'd said over the phone. "You can't just forget where you come from." I gave in, though not out of any real desire to go. If you've ever spent time in a small Midwestern town, you know how suffocating it can feel. Everyone knows your name, your family history, your mistakes. Coming back was like stepping into a snow globe where nothing ever changes, even when you want it to. That night, the cold was relentless. The sky was a dull gray, and frost coated the edges of car windows and street signs. My mom and I walked to the church, a towering stone building that always seemed too grand for our modest little town. It had been there for over a century, its stained glass windows and Gothic arches casting long shadows on the narrow streets. The service was the same as it had been every year. A mix of hymns, prayers, and candles lit for the departed. I sat near the back, my hands stuffed into my coat pockets, half listening to the priest drone on about remembering the dead. About halfway through, I noticed something strange. The church was packed, more so than usual. At first, I thought the town had finally decided to show up in force. But the longer I looked, the less sense it made. There were faces I didn't recognize. There was a man in a dark coat with a high collar, his features pale and sharp. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the altar. A woman in an old-fashioned bonnet sat 2 rows ahead of me, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Behind her, a child clutched a worn teddy bear, his face expressionless. They weren't whispering like everyone else. They didn't even blink. The priest invited everyone to come forward to light candles for loved ones. My mom nudged me, but I shook my head. I wasn't feeling up to it. As people shuffled toward the altar, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Not the kind that comes from the cold, but something deeper, more primal. I glanced over my shoulder. The back row of the church was empty, but I could have sworn someone had been sitting there moments before. My eyes flicked to the shadows near the old oak doors, but they were just that, shadows. When the service ended, I stepped outside, grateful for the brisk air. The odd tension from inside seemed to dissipate the moment I crossed the threshold. My mom lingered, chatting with her friends, so I started walking home alone. The streets were empty, silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. As I turned a corner, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They weren't hurried, but steady, deliberate, keeping pace with mine. I stopped, and so did the footsteps. My pulse quickened. I turned around, half expecting to see one of the strangers from the church, but there was nothing. Just the dim glow of the streetlights and the shadows they cast. I hurried the rest of the way home, telling myself it was just nerves. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about it. I buried myself in schoolwork, catching up on assignments I'd neglected. But the feeling didn't go away. It started small, a flicker in the corner of my eye, the sense of being watched when I was alone in my dorm. I told myself it was stress, that I was imagining things. But then the dreams began. Every night, I found myself back in the church. The strangers were there, standing in a circle around me. Their faces were pale and indistinct, like smudged charcoal sketches. The child was always at the center, holding a candle. Its flame barely flickered, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. Each time, I woke up drenched in sweat, the whispering from my dreams still echoing in my ears. After a week of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I started digging into the church's history, hoping to find some logical explanation for what I'd seen. The deeper I went, the darker the story became. The church wasn't just a place of worship. During a massive influenza outbreak in the early 1900s, It had been converted into a makeshift morgue. Hundreds of bodies were stored there, many of them unclaimed. What struck me most was the record of a fire that had nearly destroyed the church a few years later. It was said to have started in the basement, where the bodies had been kept. Witnesses reported hearing screams, though no one was inside when the fire began. I tried to dismiss it as folklore, but the timing felt too perfect. The church vigil, the whispers, the strangers, they were all connected. The last straw came one night when I was walking back from the library. The streets were deserted, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. As I crossed the campus courtyard, I saw him, the man in the long coat. He stood beneath a streetlight, his face hidden in shadow. I froze, my breath visible in the cold air. Slowly, he raised a hand and pointed to something behind me. I turned, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, he was gone. I don't know what possessed me, but I decided to return to the church. I needed to confront whatever this was, to end it once and for all. It was nearly midnight when I arrived. The church loomed ahead, its windows dark, its doors locked. But the side entrance, the one that led to the basement, was ajar. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something compelled me forward, a force I couldn't explain. The basement was cold, the air thick with the scent of damp stone. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of rusted shelving and broken pews. At the far end of the room, I saw it, a small circle of candles, their flames flickering weakly. As I approached, the temperature dropped. My breath fogged in the air, and the whispering began. It wasn't coming from any one direction, but seemed to surround me, a chorus of voices too faint to understand. In the center of the circle lay a single candle, unlit. My hands trembled as I reached for the matches in my pocket. The moment the flame touched the wick, the whispering stopped. For a brief moment, the room was silent. Then the air shifted, and I felt something leave, a presence, heavy and oppressive, now lifted. I don't remember leaving the church. The next thing I knew, I was standing outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The dream stopped after that. So did the sightings, the whispers, the footsteps. Whatever had been haunting me was gone. But every November, when the air grows cold and the nights stretch long, I find myself thinking about that night. I light a candle, not out of fear, but as a gesture of respect. Because now I believe it. When the veil thins, some souls need help finding their way.
Please subscribe for more stories.